crash course in Jewish history. There's a great quote. It's an apocryphal quote where Mark Twain writes like a long letter to a friend or something like that. And at the end of the letter, he says he apologizes for writing such a long letter. He didn't have time to write a short one. I think that's really profound. It's very hard. You talk about a crash course in Jewish history. In a certain sense, trying to condense, 5,785 years into 5 courses, 5 classes is a bit of a challenge. And of course, the goal is only going to be to get major sweeps. We're not, there are so many things along the way that a person could write an entire PhD thesis on, and we're going to be zipping through things. So the goal here is to really get bigger picture ideas, to really get the broader sense. It's to see the forest and not so much the leaves, but sometimes we'll take a look at a couple of those leaves. That's kind of the general sense of what we're going to try to do. But just as long as we keep that in mind, like I'm not going to be able to go granular onto too many details. And there are going to be things that we're going to have to pick and choose. But the basic idea is to get a sense of what things are. There is a famous passage, an idea. It's attributed. I know Rabbi Moshe Nachmanides. He writes it he actually mentions it in last week's Torah portion, the week before that Torah portion. He talks about Maise Avos Simin Labanim. Maise Avos Simin Labanim, which means the actions of our forefathers are a simin, a portent for the children. And sort of like the question, why do we bother? What's the point of studying history? Why should we look at it? Why should we come to a crash course in Jewish history? What do we have to gain from it? I would argue this message of Ramban, Maise Avos Simin Labanim, the actions of our forefathers are portents for their children. Really for 2 reasons, or at least 2 reasons that I could think of. Ramban himself, I think, identifies the idea of, we don't live in a vacuum. We don't live in a vacuum. We are part of a long chain of destiny and humanity. And the actions and the stories of, our ancestors, those who came before us, their mitzvahs, the things that they've done, actually create a certain pattern. It's their behaviors, their mitzvahs, their things that they've done actually are imprinted, as it were, on our very DNA. It gets passed down generationally. So if we want to better understand who we are, if we want to have a better understanding of what our struggles and what our opportunities and the things in our lives, it's probably worth our while to study where we've come from, because Maise Avos Simin Labanim, the actions, the mitzvahs, the deeds of our ancestors, really are implanted on who we are, on our very makeup. But I think there's another idea. There's another perhaps simpler, more fundamental idea why I think it's always a good idea to study history. Of course, the pithy statement goes, all right, those who fail history are doomed to repeat it, right? Think about that, right? Does anyone get that? If you fail history, you have to repeat the class? Okay. But there's a lesson to it as well. The King Solomon in his wisdom, of course, tells us, Ma shahayahu sheyiyeh, that which was, that's what's going to be. Uma shena'asa hu sheyaseh, and that which has been acted, that's what's going to happen again. Ve'ein kol chadash tachas hashamesh. There's nothing new under the sun. But there's going to be something, no, but not, Rabbi, this is new. Yesh davar she'omar reizeh chadash. There's going to be something that you're going to say, no. Of course, Solomon, you weren't talking about this. You weren't talking about that. Kfar hayala olamim. Trust me, says King Solomon. It's been around that way for eternity. Asher hayal milfonenu. It's been around from, way before us. And the reason why you think it's new, history's forgotten it, or you haven't studied it well. There is nothing new under the sun. It's actually pretty smart. And I think the commentaries explain, I could be doing some poetic license here, but I think the reason why this is true is fundamentally, the reason why history, there certain seem to be patterns in history, is because I think it was Emerson who said is that at the end, there's no such thing as history. There's only biography. It's very smart. There's no such thing as history. There's only biography. I'm pretty sure that was Emerson. What makes history? What makes things happen in the world? People. Guess what? People are fundamentally basically the same in many ways. Our jealousies, cravings, rages, temptations, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, challenges, all the things that make us human, the major drivers of human behavior and ambition and the things that drive us have been the same. Now, in Judaism, we believe deeply in a concept of Hiskatnu Hadoros. The generations have indeed changed. And the world is not the same place that it was 5,000 years ago. It's not the same place it was 50 years ago. Frankly, it's not the same place it was 5 years ago. And of course, that's true. But a lot of the patterns, a lot of the fundamental things that drive human behavior, those things really are pretty much a constant. And it therefore behooves all of us, to take sometimes a closer look of where we've come from if we want to get a better sense of where we're going. So where do we start? Where should Jewish history start? So it's a hard question whenever you talk about any history course. Where do you start? There aren't always such great lines of demarcation where different studies begin and end, because there's always something that, even something like American history, which it's probably the most concrete beginning, 1492 and Columbus. Okay, but why did Columbus come to the new world? Who was in the new world before Columbus? It's always like, where did it come from? So I think, of course, the best place to start when you talk about Jewish history and you talk about a crash course in Judaism, no better place to start than Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz, in the beginning of the creations of the heavens and the land, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Rashi begins his masterful commentary with the famous question that he asks. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, he quotes in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak. The tradition, many people say, what was Rashi's real name? Anyone remember? If you've ever taken this class before, Rabbi Shimon Yitzchaki, his father's name was Yitzchaki, and people say he quotes a passage from a rabbi named Rabbi Yitzchak to give honor to his father. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak says, Lo hayat tzarich lahaschel satorah me'achodesh hazelachem. Rashi very interestingly asks, the Torah, of course, we know begins with the Genesis narrative. It begins with the narrative, the Jewish understanding, the Torah understanding of Genesis, of creation. And Rashi asks, why does the Torah begin at that point? Really, the Torah should begin with the Jewish people getting the first mitzvah that they received, the first commandment, which, if you recall, is actually not in the Ten Commandments, actually a little bit earlier when the Jews are in Egypt. They got the first commandment the Jewish people received was HaChodesh HaZalachem, to set up a Jewish calendar. And Rashi says, why is the Torah starting with the Genesis narrative? It should start from telling us the mitzvahs, which is a fascinating thing just to begin our conversation. The Torah, which is going to be certainly what we're going to follow, certainly for class 1, when we talk about biblical times, which is going to be the main focus of tonight's discussion. When we talk about the Torah, to recognize Rashi's really highlighting just from his very question, Rashi says, why doesn't the Torah start with the first mitzvah? Why does the Torah start with Genesis? I would ask, Rashi, what are you talking about? If you're going to start a history book, start at the beginning of time. The answer is Rashi is pointing out the Torah is not a history book. This is a very important point. The Torah is not written as a history book. It has history in it. It has, as a general rule, a certain chronology to it, but it is not a history book. And that's an important point. What's even more interesting, or perhaps really fascinating, is Rashi's answer. Why does the Torah start by telling us the story of creation, the Genesis narrative? And of course, Rashi tells us, Umatam Pasach beBereshis. Why does the Torah start with Bereshis, with the story of creation? Quotes the verse, Mishram Koach Maisav Higid La'amo. The strength of his actions, God teaches his nations. God wants to tell the world how strong God's in control. God created heavens and earth. Why? Rashi explains. So if people come and they say, Listim atem, you're a bunch of thieves. You're in the land of Israel and you stole it, right? Genocide. You stole the land of Israel. We'll say, hey, who created the heavens and the earth? It was God. And God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people. It's fascinating. One can ask, that's great. Wonderful. So when we go to our Iranian friends, our Palestinian friends, and they say we're the occupiers, it's a beferish Rashi. Rashi said it's right there in Rashi. Rashi said it's our land. It's God said so. Are they going to buy that argument? Probably not. So what in the world is the Torah teaching us? What is Rashi teaching us? I think what Rashi's saying, this isn't an argument that we're supposed to necessarily broadcast to other people. Hey, folks, you got to follow our Torah. That's not what it is. Rather, it's for us to know the answer. It's for us to know. If you want to know why do I believe it, it's because God created the heavens and the earth, and God can decide whatever he wants. And if God gifted it to us, it's coming to us. And it's not so much, to say, come on, guys, it's in a Rashi, but rather it's for us to be aware of. So the story of creation, if you go and we're, of course, standing in the year, if you reverse engineer the Torah, basically, if you reverse engineer the Torah, you need a little bit of help along the way, but it basically will come out that we're standing in the year 5,785 from creation, 5,057.85 from creation. That's just if you kind of calculate the Torah and work backwards, that's the number that you will, of course, get. And God creates the heavens and the earth. And terrific. We know, of course, God creates Adam and Chava, Adam, Eve. And the message of God's creation, God created the world to bring the Kavod HaMakom, to bring the glory of God down to mankind, so that the Kavod Shemayim, the glory of heaven, will be accepted and recognized and performed by all of mankind. And of course, Adam, Eve, they have children. And within a few generations, the earth spirals downward. And the earth fails. Mankind fails. God needs to reset the world, as it were. He brings about the flood. We know God brings the flood right around the year 1600 or so from creation. God has to hit the reset button, because the goal of mankind, so that we can become godly people, mankind had failed. And God has to reset the world. He saves, of course, we know Noach and his children. This is really not, if you stop right here, this is not the beginning of Jewish history. Adam, Chava, Adam, Eve, Noah, they were not Jews in the colloquial sense. Did they recognize God? Were they godly people? Of course. Would we call them Jewish in the classic sense? Probably not. They certainly were not obligated, as it were, in all the mitzvahs. And as we'll see what it means exactly to be Jewish, we'll get to that shortly. But in the classic sense, they are not Jewish. And in this sense, Judaism is not a universal religion. Everyone is expected and required to achieve a certain level of godliness. That was the mandate for mankind after Adam and Eve and his children and their descendants, and they failed. Noach, God resets the world with Noah and the ark and the Teva, and Noah and his children, well, they recognize God, but again, the pattern continues. Just a few generations after Noah and the flood, the world has spiraled downward again into a crazy place, a place of paganism, a place of tyranny, a place of corruption, a place of evil, a crazy world, a world without rules, a world without order, a world without laws, a world without God. And it's in that world, it's in that universe that a child is born. A child is born into a pagan home, into a home of idolatry, into a home not really recognizing God. And his name, of course, was Avram. He's born in Mesopotamia. And as a child, without any teacher, the Rambam makes this point very emphatically. Abraham, doesn't have a teacher, doesn't have anyone to teach him anything. On his own recognition and awareness, he comes to the recognition that there must be a Ribbon Shalom, there must be a creator of the heavens and the earth. How? Again, a universal idea. Look at creation. Look at the patterns of the world. Look at the beauty and harmony of science. Look at intelligent design around you. You don't really need a teacher to recognize there must be a painter who painted this beautiful, work of art. And Avraham on his own comes to the recognition that there must be a Borei Olam. There must be a creator of the world. And if there is a creator of the world, Avram also understood that creator created and endowed within humanity kindness. It's a compassionate God. He's done so much to make the world so beautiful. It must be that's part of the mandate. And Avraham starts proclaiming monotheism. Avram starts proclaiming and preaching that we've got to be nice. We've got to clean up our act. And of course, no one wants to listen to him. And as we read in the Torah a few weeks ago, God tells Avraham, Lech lecha me'artzecha. Avraham grows up in Mesopotamia. That's Iran, Iraq, that area. And God tells him it's time to go forth. You can't stay where you are. Lech lecha me'artzecha. You've got to wander. You've got to leave your house. You've got to leave your home. You've got to leave the house of your father. El ha'aretz asher areka. You're going to go to a place which I will show you. And of course, Avram ends up in the land of Canaan, modern-day Israel. And it's interesting, a point I always ask or always focus on, we know Hebrew. We speak Hebrew. What's the Hebrew word for Hebrew? Ivrit, right? What does the word Ivrit? Ivrit is how, right? It's a funny question. How do you say Hebrew in Hebrew? Is Ivrit. What does the word Ivrit mean? It's another interesting question. We talk about Ivrit. What does that word even mean? Abraham is called Avraham ha'Ivri. Avraham the Hebrew. Well, what does that word even mean? Avram the Hebrew. So the Medrash tells us it's because he's from Me'ever HaNahar. Ivri means from the other side. That Avraham, as it were, presumably it's a reference, I'm guessing, to the Jordan River. Avraham had come from the east. And God told Avraham, Lech lecha me'artzecha. God tells Avraham when he's an elderly, he's already 75. God tells Avraham it's time to leave. And he ends up in the land of Israel. So the people in the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, they call Avraham the Ivri, Abraham the Hebrew, the Ivri. Ivri meaning he's from the other side of the river. But of course, Rabbi Yehuda in the Medrash, one of the great sages, he says, no, the word Ivri, although it does mean from the other side, it doesn't mean geographically he is from the other side. It's not just a reference of where Avraham came geographically, but it's where Avraham came ideologically. It's what Judaism represents. It's that Avraham was me'ever echad, v'kol ha'olam kulo me'ever echad. Abraham, ideologically was on one side of the world, and the rest of the world was on the other side of the world. And that's a pattern. We talk about Maisa Avos Siman Labanim. The actions of our parents, the actions of our forefathers being a portent, being a reflection, representing, what's going to happen with our children. Judaism and Jews will always, it's kind of been a pattern. As a general rule, the world might be over there and we might be over here. And that's okay. It's an interesting thing. I tell people all the time, people ask, Jews were in such a minority. We're such, we represent, what percent of the United States population does the Jews, we're what, 5, maybe 6 million in a country of 300 whatever million there are out here. We're a tiny fraction. There are 7.6 billion people on earth. And how many Jews are in the whole world? 14, maybe 15 million, 16, something like that in the entire world. And of course, popularity is always an important point, and we make time and time again. Popularity is a very, very poor indicator of what's right and what's wrong. It's a very important lesson, right? What makes something right and what makes something just and what makes something correct is not how many likes it gets on Facebook. It's not how many followers you have on Twitter. That is a very poor metric to use to make decisions in what's right and what's wrong in our lives. Rather, MS, truth, stands on its own. And of course, if the world is going in one direction and you find yourself in the minority, it's an important question to ask. Why am I in the minority? Why is the whole world going this way? As a general rule, if the world is going this way, it's probably a good idea to follow them, but not an exclusive rule. Sometimes, right, the world could be going in the wrong direction. And that was the world that Avraham lived in. That was the world that Avraham grew up in. And Avraham had the strength and the courage because it's very hard to go the other direction. But it's such an important lesson, a lesson that repeats itself so often. How many followers have the madmen of the world had? They've been very, very popular. And again, popularity, just because you have a big following, just because you made a lot of noise, just because you're very loud, and just because everyone is following you is not a metric. Avraham is Avraham ha'Ivri, Abraham, the Hebrew, he stands alone. And Avraham goes with his wife Sarah Yimenu, goes to the land of Israel. God, of course, tests Avraham. God promises Avraham, Lazaracha etenes haaretz azos. God promises the land of Israel to Avraham. He promises he's going to have children. And of course, what happens to Avraham? Test after test, challenge after challenge. It's almost like, right, I know it's the point Rabbi Goldman always makes. He says, like, imagine being Avraham for a second. You're motivated to do what's right. You're motivated to do the mitzvahs. You're willing to sacrifice. You're willing to prioritize. And then God gets in the way. All right, God constantly gets in the way, right? What happened? There's a famine in the land. He has to go down to the land of Egypt, right? His wife Sarah gets abducted, not just once, but twice. All sorts of problems. He has a different child, Yishmael, who drives him crazy. And that's sort of a very common pattern, right? We're all willing to work hard. We're all willing to sacrifice and do what's right. We just want to have the challenges that we want. And God doesn't give us the challenges oftentimes that we signed up for. And that's an important lesson. We often want our lives to go this direction, and God will often give us things that we are just blindsided with. Why? Because we're not as smart as God. Avram, of course, he has his child Yitzchak. As an elderly man, God blesses Avraham and Sarah. They have a child, Yitzchak, Isaac. And, Avraham, as he's in the land of Israel with his child Yitzchak, he starts teaching the messages of God, of monotheism. And according to one of the accounts in the Medrash, he's wildly successful. Many, many, many people buy in, and the world starts cleaning up its act. At least in the land of Israel, the world cleans up its act to a large degree. According to 1%, one opinion, 50% of the land started, giving up on their idolatry and became, monotheistic. And then we find Avram has his son Yitzchak, and Yitzchak takes over the mantle of leadership, as it were, of Avraham. And what do we read in this week's Torah portion? We read after Avraham dies, what happens? Avimelech, he's the king of the city-state of Gerar. Avram had dug so many wells to give people access to water, to help out other people. And what does Avimelech do? He fills in those wells. He undoes the good that Avraham does. It's as if the world takes 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Yitzchak, of course, he represents Gvura, strength. And of course, he has with his wife, Rebecca, Rivka, they have 2 children, Yaakov and Esav. And again, an important lesson. Here you have of the best of parents. You imagine Yitzchak, Rivka. We're talking about a dedicated father, dedicated mother. They do everything right as parents. And what happens? They produce an Esav. They can have children, right, that let them down. They can have children that are disappointing. And that's an important lesson. Oftentimes our kids are their own people. They make their own choices. And all we can do is educate, love, and raise them. But they're ultimately going to make their own choices. And even when we put them in the best environments, humanity, the next generation, they move on. They're going to have to make their own choices. And Yitzchak and Rivka are left with an Esav. And an Esav is a monster. He's a villain. He's evil incarnate. But they also have a Yaakov. Yaakov ish tam yoshev ohalim. Yaakov, the twin brother of Esav. He's the perfect man, a simple man. He sits in the tents. He's just going to read. He's just going to study the Torah. And Yaakov grows up, and Yaakov lives in this world of an Esav, in a world where his own brother wants to kill him. And Yaakov lives and almost represents, the way Ramban points out, Yaakov's life represents the Jew in exile. Because Yaakov, he grows up, he lives in his parents' household, but he has to flee. Esav wants to kill him, so he has to run for his life. Where does he end up? Back on the other side of the river, outside of the land of Israel. And he ends up in Lavan's household. Lavan, his uncle, Lavan Arami, Lavan, he was a liar, he was a cheat, tries to extort, he abuses Yaakov, takes advantage of Yaakov. And that's the world that Yaakov grows up in. That's the world that Yaakov has to experience. We read in the Passover Seder, Bikesh Lavan Lakares Hakol. Yaakov's going to end up marrying Lavan's, children, his daughters. And his own father-in-law, Bikesh Lavan Lakares Hakol, his own father-in-law wants to exterminate Yaakov and destroy Judaism, right? Judaism at this point, it's just individuals, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, it's all. Well, that's the whole Jewish people. It's just one person. And Lavan wants to kill him. And Yaakov experiences this anti-Semitism. Somehow, Yaakov is able to come up with an accommodation with Lavan. He's able to come up with some kind of accommodation. The next episode, we find Yaakov gets out of that jam with Lavan, and what happens? He finds himself re-encountering Esav again. Re-encountering his brother Esav, and Esav wants to kill him. And of course, we know the story, and he's able to, again, come up with some kind of accommodation. He's able to work his way out of that jam as well. Ramban teaches us so fundamentally we can learn so much, in our exile, which we've been in for the last 2,000 years. Again, Maisa Avos Simin Labanim, the actions of our forefathers, they're lessons for us thousands of years later. How did Yaakov deal with anti-Semitism? How did Yaakov deal with an Esav who wants to kill him? How does Yaakov behave? What's his response? Of course, Ramban tells us he prepares, he deals with the hatred. He deals with the world around him in 3 ways, of course. He prepares himself defensively. We got to do whatever we got to do. If someone's going to try to hurt us, we're going to do as best as we can to protect ourselves. So he prepares for Milchama. He does prepare for war. He has a whole strategy, divides his family. Some are going to go here, some are going to go there. It was a defensive tactic. But he doesn't just do that. He doesn't just say, we're going to rely on my strength. I'm going to fight back. Because he realizes I'm in an exile. I'm in Gullus. What else does Yaakov do? He sends daron. He sends gifts to Esav. He tries to buy Esav's favor. He tries to assuage Esav's anger. Because as Jews, fundamentally, we're not looking to pick a fight. We are happy to get out of confrontation. Even to the point, I'm going to give him gifts. A little bit of humility there. It's really a little bit shameful. I'm going to have to buy my way out, wiggle my way out of the problem. Right? That's not so in line with a lot of thinking, certainly in the 21st century, of got to be bold and we're never backing down and not giving an inch. That's not a Jewish idea. We're not looking for a fight, and we're even willing, I'll buy my way out of this problem, even though I don't have to. It's really not appropriate. But if that's going to save a life, if that's going to mean peace, we're willing to do that, if it's an option. And then thirdly, of course, what does Yaakov do? He prays. He davens. He prays to God. And it's a message, Ramban says, that's how our approach is supposed to be in the exile. We're not looking for fights. If we can get out of a fight, even if it means being a little bit, and it's interesting, and again, it'll be a little political. Everyone's like, IDF, we're strong. And it is. We're very thankful and appreciative, and we're going to be the first people to support, Israel and their defense and this and that. But we're not looking for a fight. Not looking for a fight. If we can get out of a fight, even if it means a little bit of humility, we'll do it, if that's an option. If we got to fight, we'll do that too. And ultimately, we know that our salvation comes from davening, from praying to God. And that, says Ramban, we're supposed to learn when we study the life of Yaakov. Interesting, it's during this very encounter where he's dealing with Esav and how he's going to get out of this problem. We find that the verse tells us, Vayavasar Yaakov levado vayavik ish imo, that Yaakov, when he's during this whole saga, he has to turn back to take care of something. He finds himself alone. And he wrestles. Vayavik ish imo. He wrestles with a man. Who is this man? Of course, the Medrash tells us this is not a man, rather it's an angel. And this angel actually represents Esav in the spiritual forces behind Esav. And Yaakov, of course, is victorious. And it's interesting, it's the angel of Esav who says, when Yaakov is victorious, the angel blesses Yaakov and says, Lo, Yaakov v'karei shmo, your name is no longer going to be Yaakov, but rather your name is going to be Yisrael. Israel will be your name. Ki sarisa im anashim umalachim vatuchal. For you have fought with men and angels, and you won. And God, in a later episode, again confirms the name of Yisrael, that we have that ability to fight. We have that ability to sarisa im anashim umalachim vatuchal, that ability to stand up. After all of those episodes, so then Yaakov, the verse tells us, Yaakov gets through those trials and tribulations. He gets through that fight with Lavan and Esav, and Bikesh Yaakov leishev b'shalva. Yaakov finally gets back to the land of Israel after harrowing years of exile. And what does Yaakov want to do? What does Jacob want? Bikesh Yaakov leishev b'shalva. Jacob just wants a little bit of peace and quiet. Now, what that means is not that Jacob wanted to sit on a beach sipping a martini and listening to good classical music while watching a football game. That's not what it means. But rather what Yaakov wanted, he just wanted stability in his life. He just wanted some calm in his life. What reason for? So he could do more mitzvahs, study more Torah to get closer to God. When we're harried, when we're constantly harassed, it's harder to do mitzvahs. Jacob just says, I want peace. I want stability. I want, life to just, not be constantly chaotic. And of course, what happens? God says, okay, you want peace? You'll get peace in the world to come because of all the mitzvahs that you're doing. It's going to be great up there. You also want peace in this world? It doesn't work like that. This world is a world of challenges. You live in a very imperfect world. Adam la'amal yulad, Mesilas Yesharim, great book of Jewish philosophy, teaches us, mankind, we were created la'amal, to work. We're here to do mitzvahs. We're here to schwitz, as they say, to sweat, to work hard. And of course, and the Rashi, the Medrash tells us, Yaakov, Bikesh Yaakov Leisha B'Shalva, Yaakov just wants to sit in peace and tranquility. So it's like Kafta Alav Rugzo Shel Yosef. And that's when, all right, just when Yaakov just wants some tranquility, what happens? He's got to deal with his bickering children. Of course, what happens? We know the story. Yaakov has 12 children, really more, 12 tribes. His 12 sons. And there's a disagreement. They get into a fight. And we know the story, what happens. They sell Joseph. Remember the story of Joseph and his brothers, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda? Yaakov has these 12 sons, and there's misunderstanding. There's disagreements. And Yosef, the other 11 brothers decide, or 10 of them at least, decide that Joseph, he needs to be removed from the situation. At one point, they decided we're going to kill him. That's how much trouble he was. In the end, they decided, you know what, we don't need to kill him, but we'll sell him to slavery and kick him out of the story. There's an amazing lesson, amazing story that has such lessons to all of us. This is such an important lesson to understanding Jewish history. Story happens about, 3,000 years into the future. So fast forward from the story of Joseph to the city of Volozhin. Where is Volozhin? I believe it's in modern day Belarus, I believe. It's in White Russia, right in the corner of like Belarus, the Ukraine, somewhere right over there. Volozhin is a tiny town, and it's the mid-1800s. Volozhin, we'll see in later, probably in class 4, probably more like class 5. Volozhin is the town of the first real modern yeshiva. Familiar, yeshiva is like a rabbinic college. Before Volozhin, you didn't have yeshivas that we, like in the contemporary sense that we talk about yeshivas. There were other academies and other things. But there was a yeshiva. It was the first yeshiva. It was the mother of all yeshivas, the great-granddaddy of all yeshivas, the Volozhin yeshiva. And there was a matter of disagreement between two towering figures of Jewish history, Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik and Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rabbi Berlin. There was a matter of disagreement about the direction of the yeshiva. They had different philosophies, different goals, different agendas. And the yeshiva was being torn apart, because they really had different philosophies of where they wanted this yeshiva, this institution, to go. And they couldn't, they tried working it out in accommodation for, quite some time. And they realized it wasn't going to work. One of them had to leave. Well, who's going to be that one? So they decided they would convene what's called the Din Torah. They brought in some of the leading sages of the Jewish people at the time. They had a tribunal, and they kind of adjudicated it as a court case. Eventually, Rabbi Berlin was given kind of the reins of the yeshiva, and Rabbi Soloveitchik would start his own, and everything ended up working happily ever after. But there's an amazing story. I forget what the name of the rabbi was, but he was obviously a very wise rabbi. And before he issued the ruling that it was going to be Rabbi Berlin was going to lead the yeshiva, he said, I want everyone to tell everyone a story. He said, I'm a rabbi, and I got to give the sermon. Every Shabbos, I got to give the sermon, got to inspire everyone. He says, you start, the beginning of the book of Genesis, and it's great. My job is easy because you have good guys and you have bad guys. You've got Noah and you got the whole world around him. Crazy. You're good guy, bad guys, the world. You've got Abraham, Avram, he's a good guy. Nimrod, he's one of the villains. You've got Isaac, you've got Yishmael, you've got Yaakov, you've got Lavan. There are good guys and bad guys, heroes, villains, right and wrong. And then we get to the story of Joseph and his brothers. You get to the story of Joseph and his brothers, and what happens? You've got these 12 brothers, and they can't get along. They have a disagreement. There's a misunderstanding. And there's real friction and real tension. And if you actually read the story and you read the narrative, you can easily make jump to the wrong conclusion and say that Joseph was the good guy and the rest of the brothers were the bad guys. And that's clearly not true if you read the story. The rest of those brothers were really, really good, excellent people. He says, that's where my job gets really hard. Because it's so much neater and it's so much easier when you've got good and bad, right and wrong. He said, the reality is that's not the case, especially within the Jewish people. There's going to be disagreements, there's going to be misunderstandings, there's going to be friction, and there's going to be tension, and it's not really so easy to say right and wrong. It's not even so clear who was right and wrong in the whole episode with Joseph and his brothers. It's easy, and if you watch maybe some of the contemporary United States, some of the movies and things like that, they just make the brothers, according to the Medrash, according to the Talmud, the brothers weren't really, they were slightly off, but it's not what you think. They off on just a little bit. These were not vengeful, spiteful brothers. They thought Joseph was acting inappropriately, and Joseph was really messing up their lives in many, many ways. And this rabbi points out, he says, this is the same story with the story in this yeshiva in Volozhin. You have this disagreement between Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rabbi Berlin. It's so, who am I? I'm going to say he's right, he's wrong, he's the hero, he's the villain, he's the good guy, he's the bad guy. You got two righteous, pious, great people, and yet still there's friction, there's tension, there's misunderstandings and disagreements. And that's Ma'aseh Avos Siman Labanim. That's a pattern in Jewish history. Wouldn't it be, it's so easy to say, why can't we all just get along? Why can't we all just, everyone? That's not in our nature. We are contentious people. We are people that have strong opinions, and it's naive a little bit. It's Pollyannish to just think that everyone is just going to get along. Everything is just going to be dead. No, we're going to have differences of opinions. Of course, the real test is how do we handle our differences of opinions? Just because we disagree, what do we do with that? But to try to believe and to try to think that everyone's just going to get along, I've got sad news for everyone. You're going to be disappointed, because that's the story of Jewish history. And it's not just this story in Volozhin. It's not just the story with with Joseph and his brothers, but it's the story of all Judaism. Throughout Jewish history, there have been real disagreements, real misunderstandings between really good people. How do we deal with that? It's a very important question. So the Jewish people, the children of Jacob, they sell Joseph into slavery. And of course, we know the end of the story. This is really the beginning of the exile to Egypt, because Joseph finds his way sold into slavery. One thing leads to another. And then, of course, where does Joseph end up? In Egypt as a slave. Not just any slave, but he then becomes imprisoned. He's thrown into the prison. And we know, and he's languishing. And I find one of the most inspiring parts of the whole Torah. Just put yourself in Joseph's shoes for a minute. Here you are, you're a young man. You've been abducted, sold as a slave, now been falsely accused, living in a prison in a country that you don't know the culture, don't know the language, don't know the people. That's pretty bad. You have no way out. You're in a prison, in that environment. What do? How do you get out? And it's so easy as all of us, like in some areas of our lives, I know I can identify with Joseph. I feel trapped. What am I supposed to do here? How do I get out of this jam? Anyone ever feel that way? Like in something in your life, financial trouble, health issue, a relationship, and you feel trapped. I have no way out of this. There's no natural way forward. And of course, Rabbi Sfarno tells us, look at that story of Joseph, because what happens? Remember the story with Joseph? What ends up happening? He's in the prison. One of his cellmates has a dream, and Joseph tells him the answer to the dream, and then the Pharaoh has another dream a couple years later, and fat cows and skinny cows, and they say, hey, there's this guy, Joseph, you should speak to him in a prison, and Vayavo el Paro. Joseph is in prison, in the worst of scenarios, and minutes later, what happens? He finds himself before the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh asks for his advice. He gives the answer. The Pharaoh says, this guy's brilliant. He's going to be the next vice president in the United States of America. And says Rabbi Sforno, this is like all of God's salvations. Yeshuas Hashem kimo rega is what he says. The expression that everyone says is Yeshuas Hashem keheref ayin. I think it comes from, one of my rabbis says it comes from this passage from the Sforno. It's just kind of over the generations, that expression has been Yeshuat Hashem kimo rega, which means the salvations of God come kimo rega, in an instant. The expression that everyone says is Yeshuat Hashem keheref ayin. The salvation of God can come at the blink of an eye. Both are true, whatever the exact expression is. And they say, go look at the story of Joseph. He's in the worst predicament. I can assure you, my guess is, I doubt anyone in this room has ever been in as bad of a pickle as Joseph was. I don't know, that doesn't mean that the next challenge, the next time you're really in a hole, that means God will save you. But I know what it does mean. It means God could save you if he wants. And there's no such thing as being trapped. We can always call to God. We can always dive into God. We always pray to God. And if God wants, he can get us out of any jam. Does it mean he will? I don't know. But don't think you're ever trapped. Don't think my situation is hopeless. Joseph is redeemed. And of course, Joseph becomes the leader of the Egyptians. We know the whole story. The brothers end up coming down to Egypt. They don't realize, and Joseph. And the next thing you know, the Jewish family of 70 people find their way down the land of Egypt, and Joseph takes care of them and sustains them. You know the rest of the story, of course, is that the Egyptians, after one generation, another generation, two things happen. A family of 70 turns very quickly into hundreds of thousands, goes from a family to a nation after a few generations. And after, not even a quarter of a millennia, 210 years, the Jewish people are now a nation of 2 to 3 million people, 600,000 men between the ages of 20 and older, roughly 2-3 million people. Rapid population increase. And we also know that what happens is the Egyptians enslave the Jewish people. It's a Holocaust, it's persecution. We know that the Jews are enslaved and tortured and pogroms. And again, sadly, this is going to be Ma'aseh Siman Labanim. This is a story of, it didn't begin in Egypt. It began with Lavan, as we saw, began with Esav. And this is a story and a pattern throughout Jewish history. We are going to be persecuted. We're always a minority. We're always a disenfranchised, group. And the world is full. It doesn't mean everyone is, bigoted and hateful, but there are many people who are bigoted and hateful. And it has been a story of Jewish history is that we get is Jewish persecution. And then, of course, as Ramban says, just like Joseph is redeemed from that jail cell, kimo rega, in the blink of an eye, in a moment, so too, of course, what happens? The Jewish people are at the lowest of the low, when they're suffering, when everything is as bad as imaginable. What happens? God, of course, sends a leader of the Jewish people, Moshe Rabbeinu, a Moses, to lead the Jewish people. And God, of course, extracts the Jewish people from the land of Egypt. The Etzem Hayom Hazeh, in middle of the day, no nation, no person had ever left Egypt. Egypt was, hermetically sealed. And of course, what happens? God takes out the Jewish people at the Masos Ba'osos of Amopsim with miracles, with wonders, with his outstretched arm. And God takes the Jewish people out of the land of Egypt in front of the whole world, for the whole world to see. And it's an amazing thing. One of the things that we talk about. So fundamental in Judaism, when we recite the Friday night Kiddush, is so important. We recite the Friday night Kiddush. We talk about Shabbos, ki hu yom techil mikrai kodesh zecher l'yetzias Mitzrayim. We talk about Shabbos, which we talked a lot about Shabbos at the explanatory service that everyone, of course, should be coming to at 9:45 Saturday mornings. So last Shabbos, we talked about the idea of Shabbos. One of the messages of Shabbos, why we observe Shabbos, why Shabbos is so central in Jewish life, is because, of course, Shabbos, we take a day off. Why? Because 6 days a week we work. Because what we're doing is we're acknowledging that God created the world in 6 days. And what did he do on the seventh? He rested. And that's why we rest as well on Shabbos. But if you read the language of the Kiddush, it's so unusual. We say that Shabbos is what? It's Zecher L'Yetzias Mitzrayim. That observing Shabbos is a remembrance of the exodus of the land of Egypt. And asks Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Harash, also known as the Torah, he asks, no, it's not. Shabbos has nothing to do with the exodus of Egypt. Shabbos has to do with our acknowledgement. We're confirming our, reminding ourselves, we're reaffirming our belief God created the heavens and the earth. It has nothing to do with Egypt. Egypt happened almost a quarter of 2,500 years later. Why do we recite that Shabbos is a reflection on Zecher L'Yetzias Mitzrayim? It's a reflection on the Exodus. No, it isn't. And of course, Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Harash tells us so importantly, the reason why we say that is because it's not enough as Jews to say, I believe in a God of creation. I believe God created the heavens and the earth. That's not enough. We believe in that, but we don't believe that God created the heavens and the earth and walked away. We don't think that God created the heavens and the earth, and now he's busy with important things, like nations, like big things, like who's going to win the Super Bowl. And he doesn't care about little old me. That's not the Jewish idea. Rather, we believe that God created the heavens and the earth, and he's intimately involved in the affairs of mankind. And that there's right and there's wrong. And every now and again, God, if he needs to, he'll hit the reset button. That was the story of the flood. And that's the story with the Exodus of Egypt. God punishes the Egyptians for doing that which was wrong. God had a plan and a destiny for the Jewish people. He got them out. And by the way, how did he do it? With miracles, with the 10 plagues, b'masos ba'osos of Moksim, with signs, with wonders, with miracles. The point of all those miracles was a way of demonstrating, a way of highlighting, and a way of teaching eternity for all mankind to know that I didn't just create the heavens and the world and the earth and walk away, but I created the heavens and the earth, and I've got a plan. And there's accountability to make sure that everyone is living up to that plan. And there's responsibility if we aren't living up to that plan. God is keeping score. God has a plan. And God has accountability and responsibility for our actions. And that fundamentally is the story of the Exodus of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the story of the Exodus of Egypt. And that's why we recite it when we talk about Shabbos. When we say the Kiddush, we talk about that Shabbos is Zecher L'Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's a remembrance of the Exodus of Egypt. 50 days after the Jews leave Egypt with all those miracles. You're talking about a nation of millions of people. Of course, they have to quote Ronald Reagan, a rendezvous with destiny. Right? The greatest rendezvous with destiny in the history of mankind. Because, of course, 50 days later, where do the Jewish people find themselves? At Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai. And this is where the descendants of Abraham, the children, the offspring, the children of Israel become Jewish. It's at Mount Sinai where God tells the Jewish people, Atem tiyu li lamechas kohanim v'goy kadosh. You will be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And God and the Jewish people enter into a covenant. As we mentioned before, Judaism does not have a monopoly on spirituality. In a certain sense, one could argue, is Judaism a universal religion? Yes and no. It's universal in the sense that we believe as Jews, we don't have a monopoly on spirituality. It's universal in the sense that everyone is loved by God. Chaviv Adam shenivra b'tzelem. How precious is every single one of us. 7 billion people on earth. You're so precious. You were created in the image of God. And God has a plan for every single person. And every single person has the opportunity to get close to God. How do we do that? By doing the mitzvahs. No matter who you are, God gave us the 7 mitzvahs, 7 Noahide laws. That applies to all of humanity. Basic laws of being good people, kind people, people who care for one another, decent people. And that's a mandate that, sadly, humanity doesn't keep all that well, but in a certain sense, it's a universal. Everyone can achieve godliness. Everyone can achieve spirituality. God tells the Jewish people, however, you guys, you're going to be a sanctified people, a nation of priests. But the Torah tells us later on, it alludes to it at the end of the Torah, that that Hofia Mehar Paran, that God offered the Torah, as it were, as a covenant to all the nations of the world. Said, hey, did anyone interested? Anyone want the Torah? And I was like, no, thank you. We'll stick to where we are. But of course, the Jewish people, what did we say? Our ancestors said, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will listen. You and me, God, we buy in. Sign us up for the covenant. And the Jews entered that covenant, and what that meant was that's when the Jewish people become a nation. That's when they become Jewish, in the sense that we are now bound to observe all of the mitzvahs in the Torah. And guess what? There's no backsies. And that's why Judaism, it's a rigorous, beautiful religion, but a lot of requirements. And the Jewish people experience revelation at Sinai. It's interesting. Rambam tells us so importantly. Talk about all those miracles that happened. 10 plagues, splitting of the sea. The Jews then live in the desert, in the midbar. All sorts of miracles. They live a miraculous lifestyle. Rambam tells us, I want you to know, we don't believe in the Torah because of miracles. We don't believe in the Torah. We don't believe in Moshe. We don't believe in the divinity of the Torah because some miracles happen. Just think about it. Let's say I perform a miracle before your eyes. What does that mean? It just means I can do something that you can't explain. That's not the basis of our religion. Just because Moses did a miracle, just because someone else can claim to do a miracle, just because David Copperfield could make the Statue of Liberty disappear. Anyone ever see that? It's actually amazing. Go Google it on YouTube. One of the coolest tricks that the guy, he lives right there, right? Doesn't he live like right across the street? He made the Statue of Liberty disappear. I don't know how he did it. Doesn't matter. All it proves is he could do something that I can't explain. We believe fundamentally in the Torah. The Jewish people believe in Judaism because God, unlike in any other religion under the sun, God revealed himself, not just to one guy, not just to Paul on his, some Saul from Tarshish on his way to Damascus. It wasn't just to two people. It wasn't just Muhammad. God revealed himself. The divine revelation wasn't just to one person or two people, but it was to 2 to 3 million Jews. Everyone saw. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, asher hotzicha me'eretz Yisrael. Everyone perceived and had that revelation. And where does Judaism come from? Where does our belief in the divinity of the Torah come from? It comes from mass revelation, a claim that no other religion makes because it's an impossible claim to make, because you can't start such a story. You cannot start such a narrative. And of course, the Jews at Sinai, that's when we become the Jewish people. What's so interesting is what happens 40 days after revelation at Sinai. 40 days after revelation at Sinai. What do the Jews have? What happens? The Jewish people are dancing around a golden calf. Dancing around a golden calf. Highlighting that we can have real spiritual highs and we can be really inspired and really, feel great. That's amazing. I had the best Yom Kippur ever, right? And then we find ourselves a month later doing the same old garbage. And because being inspired is not good enough, we sometimes, we think, if only I had a miracle in my life. If I had divine revelation, now I'd be great. It doesn't work like that. If we want to be great people, you can't get us, right? You're going to have to work hard. And the Jewish people, despite having been at Sinai, just a few days earlier, they make mistakes. We're an Am Keshei Oref. We're a stiff-necked, stubborn people. And it wouldn't just be the Chet HaEgel, it wouldn't just be the Jews at the sin of the golden calf, but the Jews would sin over and over. They complained about not having enough food. They complained about this. They complained about that. Of course, tragically, one of the great complaints that they had, they would complain about, the land of Israel, the Meraglim, the sin of the spies. And they said, the land of Israel isn't for us. Land of Israel is never good for us, right? Pattern. Of course, that one was the one that God didn't like. God didn't like any of them. But right? God punishes the Jewish people and says, you're going to stay in this desert for 40 years. And it'll only be your children that will enter into the land of Israel. The Jewish people complain about Moshe Rabbeinu. They complain about Moses. Story of Korach. There's a rebellion, civil war. They accuse Moshe and the leadership. Our leaders are never good enough for us. Moshe, you're corrupt, hoarding power. Moshe is the greatest of all men. Ish Moshe Anav Me'od. He's the most pious and righteous of men. And what happens? He's not good enough for the Jewish people. We complain about our leaders. We complain about our rabbis. I hear it all the time, right? And it's a pattern. What's so interesting is so nothing changes, right? Ein chadash tachas hashamesh. What happens at the end of the Torah? Moses is about to die. The Jewish people, they waged war almost with God. And they said, we're not going to let you take Moshe. We love Moshe. We're not going to let you take him. They wanted to hold on to him. What happened? You were the same people that you think, this guy, that guy, Moses. You were complaining about him 2 minutes ago. It's so class. There's a passage again in Koheles. It's not a smart idea to say, the rabbis from the previous generation. When Moses is about to die, when you think back on when Moses is around, he's no good. But right, the guy before him, he was great. Says King Solomon, don't say, yes, the previous generation was good. It's not a wise thing to ask. It's not a wise thing to ask. Every generation gets the leaders that they're supposed to get. Yiftach bidoro, says the Gemara. Yiftach, who was one of the least, he was a pretty mediocre leader of the Jewish people. But Yiftach in his generation, Kishmuel Madoro, he was like a Solomon in his generation. God gives us the leaders that we're supposed to get. And it's so easy, it's so natural and human. Like we become we romanticize the past. And it's true today. Talking about the United States of America, everyone thinks, oh gosh, if only it were that we could turn back the clocks to the 1930s when the United States looked like a beautiful Norman Rockwell painting and everything was great and everything was wonderful. Guess what? Two things. A, the world wasn't so great in the 1920s, 1930s. It's not true. We romanticize the past. B, lo mechach masha'alta zos. God puts us where we're supposed to be. You have everything that we need. In terms of our leaders, in terms of our resources, we have everything that we need. And that's the story of the Jews. When Moshe Rabbeinu was alive, when Moses was alive, they were constantly bickering with him. When he's gone, we want Moses. Right? We can't let him go. And the story of the Torah ends with the Jews on the precipice of entering the land of Israel. Please God, next week we'll start talking about. I kind of broke it up. Not the flyer isn't quite right. I thought we would cover the times of the Torah, the 5 books of the Torah in today's course. Next week we're going to meet on Wednesday. So this week was on Monday, but moving forward we're going to meet on Wednesdays. Next class we're going to talk about the 2 temple eras: the Beis Hamikdash, the Beis Rishon, the Beis Sheni, the story of the Jews in both commonwealths when they were in the land of Israel. Can I have 2 minutes just to end with one thing? Do we have time? Let's maybe just to end on, the story of the Torah, not the story of the Torah. Some of the questions that people have with the Torah, this is a history class, is, there are people who have certain problems with the Torah historically. As we mentioned, the Torah is not a history book. It has history in it. And throughout the ages, it really began in a couple centuries ago, when people, not just Jews, we want to question the historicity, the veracity of the Torah record. And usually the criticisms will come in one of 3 categories. This is sort of how I see it. So in 30 seconds, we'll go through what these are and tell you why I don't find them problematic. Maybe we'll spend more time on them next time. Number one is people, what do you mean? Miracles. I don't believe physics is physics. Don't tell me about mun falling from the heaven. Don't tell me about splitting of the sea. The miracles just defy science. And to me, I've always thought that's a very amateurish question, and I apologize if that sounds harsh, but, where did science come from? God is the one who created science, and a miracle is exactly that. It's a breach of science. It's a breach of teva. It's a breach of nature. You can either believe it or you don't. If you believe in the Torah, the fact that science doesn't say that miracles never happen. Science just says that nature works in a particular way. But the story of the Torah, of course, is a story of nisim, is a story of miracles. I do believe in miracles. I believe that they can happen. And certainly there's no evidence that they can't happen. So we have to ask ourselves, where does our amunah, where does our belief come from? Why do I believe in the story? Why do I believe in the narrative? The fact that there are miraculous events described in the Torah, indeed, that's a question we need to ponder. Another question that people have, this was something that really emerged in the 1800s, late 1700s, really 1800s and late 1800s, biblical criticism. Naturally, people looked at the style of the Torah, the literary style of the Torah, and looked at inconsistencies, looked at the language, looked at the style of the language. And based on that, certainly the higher biblical criticism, and many people, of course, all science now tells you, based on the literary structure and literary analysis, science, or at least claiming to be science, the Torah is, of course, authored by 4 different people, 4 different tribes, and it was, J, P, D, and E, and then the redactor came along and merged it all together, and this and that. And, what's the Torah's perspective? What's a Jewish perspective to all of that? It's 2 things. Number one, it's be very careful, and I'm not getting political here, and I don't mean to be like conspiracy theory guy, because I am not. But just because we say something is science, really, what science is there? It's we couch it as scientific. There's nothing scientific about it. I'll give you an example. If, let's say, in 5,000 years from now, someone finds my cell phone, and they read all the messages that are on my phone. and they see a message that I sent to my wife. And it has a certain style, certain syntax, certain language, certain patterns. They say, okay. Then they see a letter that I sent to my attorney. It's very, very different language, very different style, very different syntax. And then they see a stupid post that I posted on WhatsApp. I'm on the dad joke WhatsApp group. I think they're the funniest thing. I posted some dumb joke on my family dad joke. I've got some totally different. And they say, look, that style, that syntax, that language doesn't match up. There were 3 Nahumeths. Right? What happened there? It was a very good observation, but the conclusions that are drawn are a very poor conclusion. And I certainly wouldn't call it scientific. And we have to be so careful when you look at literary styles and start turning and we investigate in different styles, the conclusions that we draw as if like that's a scientific, no, that's not a scientific conclusion, that is conjecture, that's speculative. And who are these people making? These are people who are coming, if you're coming from a perspective that this thing is obviously bogus, it was obviously not divine in origin, it was obviously not written by the hand of God. So of course, so now we have to reconcile who are the 5 different tribes that wrote this book. Well, you're coming with an astonishing presumption, looking at pieces of evidence and filling it back into your assumption. Well, who told you your assumption is correct? Your observation might be a good observation, that there are different styles in different places. And indeed, the Torah, our sages, of course, tell us why in some places the language is written this way and the same. You find one of my rabbis once pointed out, it's like one of the classic examples of this is Isaiah. The book of Isaiah. Have you ever read, anyone ever read the books of Isaiah? We haven't gotten up to there yet. Well, please God, next week we'll talk about it. The book of Isaiah. Everyone believes how many there wasn't just one prophet Isaiah, but rather there's at least 2 prophet Isaiahs. 2, that's already old school. Now you have to have like 50 Isaiahs. But everyone believes in 2 different Isaiahs. Why? Because if you look at the last chapters in the book of Isaiah, the language is very different. He's writing about events that didn't happen in his time. So it must be they're 2 different Isaiahs. Now again, that's working on a presupposition, my rabbi pointed out, right? That Isaiah couldn't be a prophet talking about the future. So again, if you're going to presuppose that, so then it's evidence to your presupposition. But if you're going to presuppose that that prophets possibly could talk about the future, so but then they point out the language is so different, and this is like everyone says there are 2 Isaiahs. Of course, we don't believe that. But it's so amazing. What happened, right? It was a half a century ago when we discovered in the Qumran caves, we have basically a full copy of the book of Isaiah that we can carbon date back to 2,200 years. And the scholars would be like, wow, they're shocked that the mistake of the 2 Isaiahs being merged into one book goes so far back. I'm like, that's an astonishingly wacky, presumption. Like you made up an assumption, drew your own conclusion, and now you're shocked when you find evidence that like clearly goes against your argument. And like, wow, that error must be, 2,600 years old. It's a lot of the stuff is very, very poor. We don't have time to talk about archaeology. Maybe next week, when we talk about more of the land of Israel, where the issues of archaeology and, the archaeological record, we'll talk about that and how that weaves into our story. Please God, again, next week, Wednesday at 7 p.m., we'll hold our class here. And I guess if anyone will take any questions, if anyone has any questions, I'm here to stick around.